The frantic call ripped through my afternoon like a thunderclap. My wife, Emily, was being literally dragged out of her own mother's wake by HOA security. I thought I'd misheard, the words jumbled and nonsensical. But when I arrived, the sight that greeted me was like a punch to the gut. Emily sat on the sidewalk, a broken doll in her black funeral dress, which was ripped at the shoulder. Tears streamed down her face, mascara leaving dark trails like battle scars. "Who gave the order?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. A woman with a smug, self-satisfied smirk plastered across her botoxed face and impossibly high heels pointed a manicured finger at herself. "I did," she declared, her voice dripping with icy authority. "HOA rules are rules." Shame she didn't recognize me, because I'm the state attorney general, and I don't forget things like this. It's not every day you witness your spouse being manhandled off her deceased mother's property like a common trespasser. But there I stood, on a gloomy Tuesday afternoon in Maple Ridge Estates, watching this nightmare unfold. The wake was meant to be a quiet, respectful farewell, just family and close friends sharing memories, some simple sandwiches, a few folding chairs huddled under a pop-up canopy in the front yard. Nothing extravagant, nothing disruptive. Unless, apparently, you were dealing with Karen Buckley, supreme ruler of the Homeowners Association. This woman, this self-appointed guardian of suburban perfection, saw a grieving daughter honoring her mother's memory as a Class C violation of Section 7B, unapproved gatherings. My Emily was still reeling, emotionally numb for days since her sweet mother, Eloise, passed away. This wake was the one thing anchoring her, the single opportunity she had to say goodbye properly. And this woman, this manicured, clipboard-wielding tyrant, had turned it into some twisted power trip. I crouched beside Emily on the cold concrete, pulling her trembling body into my arms. I gently smoothed her hair, stained with tears. She clung to me like a lifeline, her sobs racking her entire frame. The sheer humiliation of being ejected from her childhood home during her own mother's funeral was etched onto her face, a raw wound of grief and outrage. I stood up slowly, my mind already shifting gears. I didn't yell, didn't make a scene. I looked Karen Buckley right in her frozen, botoxed face and asked, with a clinical calm that belied the storm raging inside me, "Who authorized this?" She didn't even flinch. She just jutted her chin out, pointed to herself again like she was unveiling some masterpiece of petty cruelty, and repeated, "I did. HOA rules are rules." "Oh, honey." Emily and I got in the car. I drove her home in silence, listening to her heartbroken sobs that punctuated the heavy air. I didn't try to explain it away or fix it in that moment. I just held her hand, made her a cup of tea when we got back, and helped her gently out of her torn dress. After she finally fell asleep, exhausted and utterly broken, I sat at our kitchen table in the dark, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating my face. Not for work. For war. Let me rewind for a moment. Emily's mom, Eloise, had moved into Maple Ridge Estates 4 years prior. She was a sweet, old-fashioned woman who loved tending her rose bushes, attending neighborhood potlucks, and indulging in a bit of friendly gossip. She moved in before the HOA became the iron-fisted regime it was under Karen Buckley's reign. When Eloise got sick, Emily and I spent countless hours at that house. We trimmed her hedges, drove her to doctor's appointments, brought over meals. We were good neighbors. We followed the rules. But even then, Karen Buckley found ways to be awful. First, it was the garbage bins. Eloise left hers out maybe 5 minutes past the designated pickup time and received a hefty fine. Then it was the color of her mailbox. Apparently, earth tones weren't approved. We even got a written warning for parking our car, get this, maybe 2 inches over the edge of the driveway. Karen was the kind of person who walked around with a measuring tape and a permanent air of superiority. She lived for the small, insignificant stuff. It gave her life meaning, apparently. The thing is, she never once asked what I did for a living. She just assumed, based on my khakis, button-down shirt, and clean car, that I must be middle management at some boring paper company or something equally mundane. She never connected the dots, never realized that I'm the newly elected state attorney general. Which made this particular abuse of power more than just personal. It was jurisdictional. Now, I'm not one to throw my title around. I don't lead with it. But when someone weaponizes petty bylaws against a grieving widow, we're not talking about a simple neighborly dispute. We're talking about a bright red line being crossed, and I don't take kindly to lines being crossed. So, I started reading. Maple Ridge HOA bylaws, city zoning regulations, state statutes on private property governance. My screen glowed with a multitude of tabs and PDFs, highlighted passages and digital legal notes. I wasn't looking for petty revenge. I was looking for the first crack in their armor, because these HOA types, they love their rules until someone actually knows what they mean. It didn't take long to find the first glaring violation. According to their own bylaws, any fine exceeding $500 required a formal mediation process. There was no mediation, no hearing, just a couple of rent-a-cops, a clipboard, and my wife's profound trauma. Next, I noticed their enforcement clause wasn't properly structured. They had no documented authority to physically remove anyone from private property, especially not the family of the homeowner. And then came the real kicker. The HOA's so-called security team wasn't licensed. No permits, no training, just a couple of retired guys in ill-fitting polo shirts and cheap earpieces. Meaning, the moment they laid their hands on Emily, they opened the entire HOA up to significant civil liability. But I didn't move fast. No, I didn't send a cease and desist letter or go into full prosecutor mode. That's not how you win against people like Karen Buckley. She thrives on confrontation, lives for screaming matches at board meetings and dramatic emails filled with bold red text. What she doesn't expect is silence, calm strategy, bureaucratic precision. I didn't show up at the next HOA meeting. I let the wake incident slide publicly, letting her bask in her perceived victory, thinking her petty little crusade had somehow broken us. Meanwhile, I started laying the groundwork quietly. Calling in a few favors, requesting access to HOA filings, cross-checking state compliance documents, submitting an anonymous complaint to the state's Office of Property Association Oversight. By the end of the week, I had enough ammunition to make the entire HOA sweat bullets. But I still wasn't ready to act. Because then, Emily got the letter. A formal fine, hand-delivered by a nervous board member, for violating community policy and hosting an unregistered event. The amount? A staggering $1,250, due immediately. No mediation, no appeal. Emily broke down again when she saw it, her voice thick with fresh tears. She thought maybe we had done something wrong, that maybe she really had ruined something sacred. And that's when I decided to stop playing defense. Karen wanted to hide behind rules? I would bury her in them. But before I could file the first real motion, before I could tip the first domino in my carefully constructed plan, I got an unexpected visit. A knock at our front door late one evening. I opened it to find one of Karen's own board members, Dennis, the HOA treasurer, standing there looking like he'd just seen a ghost. He glanced nervously over his shoulder, lowered his voice, and whispered, "I think you should know something's not right with the books. And I think Karen's covering it up." That's when I realized this wasn't just going to be petty revenge. It was going to be something much, much bigger. Dennis didn't step inside right away. He hovered at the edge of the doorway, a picture of a man wrestling with his conscience, trying to decide if he was about to confess a sin or become an accomplice. I just raised an eyebrow and waited. I've learned something in my line of work: if you let silence hang long enough, the truth tends to fill it. Sure enough, Dennis glanced over his shoulder again, his eyes darting around our quiet street, and finally whispered, "I think Karen's been skimming money. Beautification funds. It's not adding up." He rubbed his hands together nervously, like he already regretted coming. I opened the door wider and motioned him in. He stepped over the threshold as if it were a pit of hot lava and perched on the very edge of our couch, still looking like he expected someone to kick the door in any second. Over the next 20 minutes, the story spilled out of him in hushed tones. Dennis, the meekest member of the HOA board, had noticed discrepancies in the budget for months. New flower beds that supposedly cost $10,000. Landscaping projects that were never actually completed. Security upgrades that consisted of 2 cheap walkie-talkies and a new, poorly printed sign. It didn't smell right, but every time he tried to ask questions, Karen shut him down, her voice sharp and dismissive. She told him it was above his pay grade and if he kept making noise, he might find himself removed from the board for undermining leadership. It wasn't just the missing money though. That's what made Dennis's visit so incredibly interesting. He said something else that made my blood run cold. Apparently, Karen had personally approved the use of physical removal by the so-called security volunteers. There was no board vote, no legal guidance, just a handwritten note from Karen authorizing them to enforce HOA compliance in real time. Translation: she told a couple of retired mall cops they could manhandle people for not filling out the right paperwork. That changed everything. I had gone into this expecting petty revenge, a legal slap on the wrist, maybe some public embarrassment for Karen. But now there were financial irregularities, potential embezzlement, unauthorized enforcement, and a board member who was scared enough to whisper it all in my living room in the dead of night. That wasn't just a crack in the dam. It was the start of a complete collapse. I thanked Dennis for coming forward, assuring him that his identity would remain protected. He looked relieved, but also profoundly terrified as he left, disappearing back into the shadows of the night. He said something that stuck with me, a chilling observation. She thinks she's untouchable because she's never been challenged. Just don't underestimate her. She fights dirty. That was cute. I fight with court subpoenas. The next morning, I got to work. First, I started collecting every document I could get my hands on. Public filings, tax documents, community financial statements. I pulled records from the Secretary of State's office to verify the HOA's incorporation status. They were technically a non-profit entity, which meant state oversight, required reporting, and most importantly, accountability. I found missing quarterly reports, expenditures that didn't match receipts, contracts that were awarded without any competitive bidding process. Then, I made a few calls. Not as the Attorney General, not yet. Just a concerned citizen asking hypothetical questions to colleagues who owed me favors. I spoke with the Office of the State HOA Oversight Board, dropped a few carefully worded breadcrumbs, and got pointed toward the right forms and procedures. I even spoke to a friend at a local news station, saying off the record, if a grieving widow was physically removed from her mother's wake by an HOA, would that make for a slow news day filler, or lead the broadcast? Her immediate response, send me the footage, and we'll lead with it. So, I did. See, what Karen didn't know was that one of the guests at the wake, a quiet neighbor from across the street, had recorded the entire scene on their phone. It wasn't high quality, the image a bit shaky, but it was enough. You could clearly see Emily, dressed in black, being pulled away from her family and friends. You could hear her heartbroken cries. You could hear the security guy saying, per Karen's orders, you're in violation. And you could see Karen herself, arms crossed, a smug expression on her face, like she was watching someone shoo a stray dog off her perfectly manicured lawn. I didn't upload the video myself. That would have made it traceable. I passed it through a burner account on a local neighborhood social media group, captioned simply, HOA removes grieving daughter from her own mother's funeral. Maple Ridge Estates. Within hours, it was spreading like wildfire. The comments section lit up with outrage. How is this even legal? This is disgusting. These people have no soul. And then came the best part, other residents from Maple Ridge chiming in with their own horror stories, tales of petty fines and overbearing rules. That night, I sat beside Emily on the couch, holding her hand as she read through the comments. Her eyes were still tired, but for the first time in days, there was a flicker of something else in their depths. Vindication. She didn't say much, just leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "Thank you." Meanwhile, Karen remained blissfully unaware, or at least she thought the outrage would blow over, a fleeting moment of neighborhood gossip. But it didn't. And I wasn't done. I filed a formal complaint with the State Office of Nonprofit Regulation, attaching meticulously documented financial irregularities, screenshots of Karen's most egregious emails, and excerpts from the HOA's own bylaws that they so readily weaponized against others but conveniently ignored themselves. Then, I submitted an anonymous tip to the Department of Consumer Protection about the HOA's blatant use of unlicensed security personnel. A week later, I saw the first real sign that the pressure was working. An emergency HOA meeting was called, behind closed doors, no minutes released. But according to a neighbor who lived down the street and had a knack for eavesdropping, Karen was absolutely furious, screaming about witch hunts and personal vendettas. She was half right. Then came the letter, delivered to our mailbox with no return address. It was printed, unsigned, and reeked of desperation and fear. It said that continued antagonistic behavior toward the HOA may result in further sanctions. Emily was shaken by it, her anxiety flaring. I wasn't. I scanned it for language, tone, and phrasing, legal posturing, empty threats. But the fact that they were scared enough to resort to anonymous intimidation meant I was winning. So, I started turning the screws. I filed a public records request with the HOA board, demanding complete financial transparency under state nonprofit disclosure laws. I gave them a strict 30-day deadline to comply. If they didn't, I'd have the legal right to escalate the matter to the Attorney General's office, which, funny enough, was me. Then, I reached out to a local independent audit firm, a reputable company known for their thoroughness. I asked them to look over the publicly available HOA records and give me a preliminary assessment. Their findings were even more damning than I had hoped. Over $20,000 in miscategorized expenses. Landscaping work billed twice. Equipment purchases from a company that didn't even exist. And one particularly curious payment, labeled vaguely as consulting services, which, upon further investigation, traced back to a relative of Karen's. It was all lining up beautifully. But then, something unexpected happened. One of our neighbors, a quiet guy named Mark who always kept to himself, came by with a small package. He said he found it on his doorstep with no name on it. Inside were photocopies of internal HOA emails, printed threads between board members. One email, from Karen, stood out like a venomous snake. "He doesn't know who he's messing with. I don't care if his wife's mother died. Rules are rules. If he keeps pushing, I'll find a way to evict them." She had no idea those words would be her undoing. Because I wasn't just building a legal case anymore. I was preparing to dismantle a petty tyranny. And Karen, in all her arrogant glory, had just handed me the match to light the whole thing up. The only question now was how big a fire I wanted to start. Continue. The fire started not with a bang, but with a knock on Karen Buckley's meticulously painted front door. It wasn't me standing there, though. It was a uniformed courier from the Office of the State Attorney General, hand delivering a formal notice of a pending legal investigation. The envelope was heavy stock, the kind that practically screamed authority before it was even opened. Inside was a multi-page breakdown of the inquiry into Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, citing potential violations of state nonprofit statutes, misuse of HOA funds, failure to comply with financial disclosure laws, and the unauthorized engagement of unlicensed security personnel. To any ordinary person, it would read like a death sentence. To Karen Buckley, I imagine it felt like a betrayal from the universe itself. After all, who dared to challenge the queen of her perfectly manicured cul-de-sac? By the time I got wind of her reaction, she'd already called an emergency meeting with what was left of her fractured board. Dennis, the perpetually trembling treasurer, updated me that 2 more members had resigned in the last week, one citing stress, the other claiming creative differences. Translation: they smelled the smoke and didn't want to go down with the house. That left Karen, Dennis, and one other loyalist, a guy named Frank who once fined a neighbor for having a ceramic gnome in their yard. Not exactly an airtight defense team. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was buzzing. The video of Emily's removal from the wake had made its rounds through local news channels, and the online comments weren't letting up. People who had lived under the iron thumb of the HOA were suddenly emboldened. An anonymous Facebook group formed, called Free Maple Ridge, where residents shared their own stories of ridiculous fines for slightly faded shutters, citations for wind chimes deemed too loud, and Karen's infamous seasonal Dior crackdown. One woman had been threatened with legal action for putting up Halloween decorations before October 1st. Another man had been written up for his son's basketball hoop being left out overnight. Petty tyranny, all of it, and now it was unraveling in the most public way possible. I kept my distance, letting the pressure build organically. I wasn't trying to be some kind of hero. I just wanted justice served cold and properly plated. But it became impossible to stay completely invisible when the audit firm submitted its final report. The numbers were even worse than I initially suspected. Over $30,000 in just improperly tracked spending. Multiple duplicate charges for security maintenance. And a series of checks written to a landscaping company that had no business license and, upon further digging, no actual employees. The owner listed on the paperwork: Karen's nephew. At that point, it wasn't just gross mismanagement. It was outright fraud. I had everything I needed: the evidence, the motive, the witness testimony from Dennis. I could have brought the hammer down myself, opened the criminal case from my own desk. But I wanted to make it cleaner, less about personal vendetta and more about impartial justice. So, I handed it all off to a special counsel, a bulldog of a prosecutor named Vera who doesn't smile and once sued an entire city council into oblivion for hiding traffic camera profits. Vera took one look at the thick stack of paperwork and said, a glint in her eye, "Oh, we're going to have some fun with this." The next week, subpoenas were issued. The HOA's bank records were requested. Karen Buckley was officially named as the subject of a state-level investigation. And still, she didn't back down. She held another HOA meeting, this time with just Frank and 2 terrified homeowners who had shown up for unrelated questions about their own minor infractions. She stood at the front of the community clubhouse, looking like a politician under siege, and delivered a speech that could only be described as delusional. According to reports, she blamed radical forces, a personal vendetta, and outsiders who don't understand our community values. Never once did she mention my name, but that didn't stop the knowing glances that darted around the room from the residents. By now, most of them had connected the dots, and I wasn't exactly hiding anymore. When I passed her on the sidewalk a few days later, walking Emily to her mom's now empty house, she tried to pretend she didn't see me. But her lips tightened, her eyes narrowed, and I saw it: the first real crack in her armor. Not fear, not yet, but a definite bloom of panic. And then came the best part. I filed a motion for a temporary injunction against the HOA, citing irreparable harm caused to residents through mismanagement, intimidation, and blatant misuse of power. With a damning audit report in hand and public support rising like a tidal wave, the court granted it, effective immediately. All HOA enforcement activity was frozen. Fines were suspended. The ridiculous security team was disbanded. Karen Buckley's little kingdom was shut down by the long arm of the law. The flyer went out the next day. Black and white, plain font, no embellishment. The HOA is currently under state investigation. You are not obligated to pay any fines or fees until further notice. It was tacked to every mailbox and slipped under every door. You could almost hear the collective exhale of the entire neighborhood. For the first time in years, people felt like they could finally breathe. But I wasn't done. Not yet. I had waited long enough. It was time for the reveal. The next HOA board meeting, technically still permitted under the injunction, although with severely limited power, was held in the community center. The place was packed, people lining the walls, a palpable sense of anticipation hanging in the air. And for the first time, I showed up. I didn't speak right away. I sat in the back row, arms crossed, just watching as Karen tried to open the meeting, her voice shaking slightly as she read from a typed agenda. When she finally asked if there were any public comments, I stood. She saw me, and for a fleeting moment, I thought she might actually bolt. But I walked slowly to the front, pulled a printed packet from my briefcase, and set it on the podium. "My name is Nate Carter," I said, my voice clear and calm, cutting through the nervous murmurs of the crowd. "Some of you know me. Some of you only know what's happened to my wife and me these last few weeks. But what most of you don't know is that I am also the state attorney general. And I have been watching this HOA violate laws, intimidate residents, and exploit grieving families long enough." The room went utterly silent. You could hear someone inhale sharply in the back. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. She looked like a woman watching her entire world slide off a cliff. I continued, laying out the findings of the investigation, the blatant misuse of funds, the illegal fines, the unlicensed security, the threatening intimidation letters. And then, I looked her directly in the eye, my gaze unwavering, and said, "You had the audacity to have my wife dragged out of her own mother's wake. You thought you could hide behind rules, behind process. But rules only protect people who follow them. You didn't follow them, and now you're going to be held accountable." I left the packet on the table, a thick stack of irrefutable evidence, and walked out. I didn't need to stay. The seeds were planted. The machinery of justice was finally in motion. Later that night, as I poured a glass of scotch and watched Emily finally smile again, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached her tear-filled eyes, I got a message from Dennis. Karen had stepped down, effective immediately. Said she was moving out of state. I looked out the window toward the community center, the lights still glowing dimly in the distance. One more queen off the board. It was strange how quickly peace returned once the tyrant fled. One day, there were laminated violation slips blowing through the cul-de-sac like autumn leaves. The next, there was just quiet. No more early morning HOA inspections. No more passive-aggressive email blasts about decorative flags being 2 inches too wide. No more warnings taped to mailboxes. Karen had disappeared as suddenly as she had once seized power. Her house went dark, a for sale sign appearing in the front yard within the week. Some people said she moved in with family out of state. Others claimed she was staying with her nephew, the one whose fake landscaping company had been collecting HOA payments. I didn't particularly care where she ended up. As far as I was concerned, her chapter in our lives was finally closed. But the damage she left behind wasn't just financial or procedural. It was emotional. Emily had spent weeks in a fog of grief after her mother's death, and Karen's cruel actions had twisted that grief into something even more painful. But now, for the first time since that awful Tuesday afternoon, I saw light returning to her eyes. Not all at once. It came slowly, like the way morning spills into a room through cracked blinds. Little things. She started tending to her mother's garden again, her touch gentle on the familiar soil. She sorted through old photo albums without breaking down in tears, a soft smile gracing her lips as she remembered happier times. She sat on the porch with her coffee in the mornings and didn't flinch at the sound of footsteps on the sidewalk. One afternoon, she asked me, her voice still a little hesitant, if it would be okay to host a small gathering at the house. Nothing big, just a few family members and close friends who hadn't gotten the chance to say goodbye to her mother properly. Of course, I said yes, my heart swelling with relief. She was nervous, still traumatized by what had happened the first time, but this time there was no HOA lurking, no fines, no threats, no patrols. Just neighbors showing up with casseroles and desserts, bringing their own folding chairs, offering quiet words of respect and support. I watched her move through the gathering, greeting people with soft hugs, offering tissues, even laughing gently when her cousin shared a silly memory about her mother's lifelong obsession with labeling every single piece of Tupperware. It was healing, and it was long overdue. I stood off to the side with a drink in hand, watching her, and realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. The fight had consumed me for weeks. Every motion I filed, every document I uncovered, every trap I laid had been fueled by a righteous fury and a burning need for justice. But watching Emily finally at peace made me realize what the fight had really been about. Not revenge. Not power. Just love. Love for someone who deserved to grieve without fear. That night, after the last of the guests had left and we cleaned up the remaining coffee cups and cake plates, Emily sat on the couch beside me and said, her voice soft, "I think Mom would have been proud of how you handled all of this." I smiled, touched her cheek, and said, "She always liked me more than she let on." She laughed, a real laugh this time, the sound filling the room like fresh air. The legal proceedings against the remaining HOA board members continued quietly in the background. I stayed out of the spotlight as much as I could. Vera was more than capable of seeing it through, and besides, I didn't want this story to be about me. I wasn't interested in headlines. I was interested in accountability. A few weeks after Karen's resignation, the court approved the HOA's dissolution under a resident petition. A resounding 78% of the homeowners signed to disband it permanently. In its place, a simple neighborhood committee was formed, informal, voluntary, no fines, no overreach, no bylaws thicker than a phone book. Just people agreeing to be decent to each other. They asked me if I wanted to serve on it. I politely declined. I told them I preferred to stay in the background, maybe offer legal advice if needed, but otherwise, I'd rather just mow my lawn without someone measuring it afterward. There was a final act to the saga, though, and it came unexpectedly. I was walking past Karen's old house one afternoon, sipping my coffee, when I noticed a moving truck outside. The new owners were unloading boxes, cheerful and relaxed. I introduced myself, and they welcomed me like we'd been neighbors for years, saying they were glad the place was finally quiet. I nodded, smiled, and before I walked away, I handed them a small gift bag I'd been saving for just this moment. Inside was a copy of the state HOA compliance handbook, a neighborhood contact sheet, and a handwritten note that said, "Just in case." A little joke, a little reminder, a little insurance policy. That weekend, a new neighborhood bulletin board went up next to the mailboxes. No official logo, no HOA stamp, just a simple wooden frame and a corkboard inviting messages and announcements. The first posting was from Emily. It was a picture of her mother's garden, now fully blooming again, with a caption that read, "In memory of Alois. Thank you to everyone who helped bring peace back to this place." It made me choke up a little, not that I'd ever admit it publicly. People started adding their own notes, kids selling lemonade, lost cats sightings, a potluck invitation. It felt like a neighborhood again, not a regime. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a local conference on legal overreach by private entities. I declined, telling them I was taking some much-needed time off to focus on my family. But I did send a one-sentence quote they could use if they wanted: "Rules should protect people, not punish them." Emily and I sat on our porch that evening, her head resting on my shoulder, the air warm and still. I looked out at the street where it had all started, where my wife had once been humiliated in the worst moment of her life. Now, that same street was quiet, peaceful, and free. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need gloating or celebration. I had something much better, closure. And just as I was about to head inside, I saw a car slow roll past the neighborhood, the driver scanning the houses like they were remembering something. The window was tinted, but the silhouette looked familiar, hair pulled back in a tight bun, shoulders stiff. The car didn't stop, just drove by slowly, deliberately. I smiled. Maybe it was Karen. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, I wasn't worried. Because if she ever dared to come back, she wouldn't be facing just me. She'd be facing an entire neighborhood that had finally learned how to stand up for itself. Valuable lesson: this story highlights the importance of knowing your rights and the power of collective action against even the most overbearing forms of authority. It also demonstrates that true strength lies not in petty tyranny but in empathy and community. What are your thoughts on this story? Have you ever experienced or witnessed similar situations? Share your comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more compelling stories and insightful content.